with this webinar. Thank you for your attention and welcome to the webinar session made by the NextGen project of program of the SOELI of the International Insolvency Institute. I am Carlo Ghia, a NextGen alumni, and we would like to make the introduction of this webinar with Annika Wolf, which is the Executive Director of the International Insolvency Institute. So you may go, Annika.
Thank you, Carlo, and welcome to this very exciting seminar that's organized by the NextGen of the International Insolvency Institute. As the International Insolvency Institute, we are very delighted to bring to you this very up-to-date topic about the impact of COVID-19 on sovereign debt and what is the situation, looking at different countries around the world and talking to really specialists in this field with Rosa, Lastra, Stephen Kargman, Ivan Romo, and our dear Christoph, Paulus. So with that, I'm giving it back to you, Carlo. Thank you very much for organizing, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Carlo, you're on mute, I think.
Thanks to Annika, and sorry about that. Thanks to Annika, and thank to the SOELI for giving us, to the NextGens, the great opportunity of realizing this webinar and the project. We had a lot of sessions during the last months, and we will go on with these projects, accumulating material in order to make also some researches on the various measures that have been adopted internationally in consequence of the impact of COVID-19. Today we will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on a specific sector, which is the sovereign debt, and we will talk about it and about some arguments, which are the perspectives of the institutions, which are the experiences of emerging markets and single areas such as Latin America. We will focus a little bit also on China and some particular experiences. We will talk about the role of creditors within the sovereign debts of the states. We will talk about this with Professor Rosa Lastra from who is a professor at Sir John Lubbock Chair in Banking Law, and who is chair of the Institute of Banking and Finance Law in the Center for Commercial Law Studies. Then we will talk with Ivan Romo, managing partner of SOELI Consulting from Mexico, Steve Kargman from USA, founder and president of Kargman Associates, who is an expert and esteemed colleague with a New York-based strategic advisory firm specializing in international restructurings. And Professor, last but not least, Professor Christoph Paulus from Germany, Professor of Insolvency Law at Humboldt-Universitat. So now that I made the presentations, we give the floor to Professor Rosa Lastra, who will introduce us a general situation of sovereign debt. Okay, Professor, you may go.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to start by thanking sorry for that. I would like to start by thanking the International Insolvency Institute and NextGen for inviting me to contribute to this timely and topical discussion.
Mama.
Sorry, I don't know how
Okay,
I got
it's okay. You may go, no problem.
I don't know how I got one of my children to get into my computer. Anyway. Thanks also, this is some of the challenges of having a webinar. I thought I have everything ready today, but obviously there's this communication. Anyway, thanks also to Carlo, Annika, and Brandy for the planning of the event. And it is really a great pleasure to share the podium with such distinguished panelists as Professor Christoph Paulus, Ivan Romo, and Steve Kargman. Though I do not wish to be a Cassandra, I would like to focus my brief presentation on why I think that a systemic sovereign debt crisis post-COVID cannot and should not be ruled out, and in particular, what role the IMF can play to avoid a last decade like in the 1980s. The IMF, as we all know, plays a unique role because of its debt sustainability assessments, because it provides financial support when no other support is available, because its programs of assistance give a seal of credibility to any reform effort by troubled debtor countries, and because it has traditionally played the role of referee, arbiter, or master of ceremonies between creditors and debtors. Indeed, the IMF paper, published on October 1st, just ahead of our session, a timely paper, which is the International Architecture for Resolving Sovereign Debt Involving Private Sector Creditors, Recent Developments, Challenges, and Reform Options. This paper again shows why the IMF is truly an intellectual anchor when it comes to sovereign debt. But the problems that the IMF is referring to in the paper and the problems of sovereign debt, though we are discussing it in the context of COVID and COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, we have to realize that some of those debt vulnerabilities actually predate COVID-19. And indeed, the recent debt workouts in Ecuador and Argentina, to which I think that both Ivan and Steve may be referring to, they actually respond to pre-coronavirus problems, even if they have taken place in the world post-COVID. And the pandemic, what it is, and again, this is an issue that I know Steve will also discuss further, is a blow to an already very fragile economic outlook. The past decade has seen the largest, fastest, and broadest in terms of creditor-based increase in debt in the last 50 years. And again, this is something which is reflected in the IMF paper, as well as IMF blogs, which ahead of the annual meetings are posting relevant information in this very important theme and topic. Many highly indebted low-income countries, they face now increased government costs with fewer resources, less fiscal space, less income, and less capacity to act. So obviously the outlook is not very good. The Jubilee Debt Campaign reckons that there are around 32 countries at the risk of a private sector debt crisis. This is a very fundamental crisis in the making, and I think that it is the responsibility of the international community through the institutions that we have, as well as academic debate, to prepare for that. Also very timely, not only the IMF paper, Libu, Haidt, and Mitu Gulati, two dear friends and colleagues. I actually, with them, have the Sovereign Debt Forum, which is another initiative that I invite all of you to participate. I can send the link later on. They suggest in a recent paper that there is a serious risk of undershooting. And by undershooting, they mean providing less debt relief that is necessary in sovereign debt workouts post-COVID. And they note, with obviously concern, the uncertain look for commodity prices, tourism, remittances, and tax revenues, which are often the main source of income for many of these countries who are now suffering problems. And the outlook is very uncertain. And then they look at the historical experience of what happened in the 1980s in order to draw some lessons. And indeed, the short and very shallow debt restructuring in Latin America under the Baker Plan proved to be ineffective. And it was only the Brady Plan in 1989 that finally provided much needed debt relief together with HIPC and others, but the commencement of the end of that lost decade was 1989. So in the light of the different composition of the creditor base today, obviously we all know that is bond rather than syndicated lending, and the generalized acceptance of collective action clauses, Lee and me to propose what they call a COVID codicil to be added to collection action clauses, to CACs. But so far, the world has managed to avoid a systemic debt crisis, and that's the main point I want to discuss with you today. And why is that? I argue, and I think the IMF also argues, is because on the one hand, extended financial and fiscal national support, and on the other hand, and perhaps even more importantly, because of extraordinary monetary policy support, QE, quantitative easing, and swap arrangements, For instance, only in the US, they have added $7.3 trillion US by way of monetary policy support, which is obviously a very, very significant amount and raises questions going forward as to the arsenal that is available for the authorities to continue to provide the support. So this actually has bought the world some time, but for how long? The UN estimates that 100 million people will enter extreme poverty due to the pandemic. And the International Labour Organization has estimated that since the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, 500 million jobs have been lost. This is not looking very good. So what can be done to avert a systemic crisis? And I wish, of course, I had the solution. But let's just say a couple of issues that perhaps we can take further in the debate and in the Q&A. The IMF recommends that the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which, by the way, only focuses on debt to official creditors, be extended for another 12 months into 2021. Others, such as myself, have proposed that private creditors should also participate in the DSSI. I know this is contentious, but I think it's necessary. The IMF has also recommended debt transparency, given the problems of hidden debt, something which I guess my colleagues today will also discuss, and that countries with debt vulnerabilities must tackle them urgently, because when debt is unsustainable, it should be structured, we have all learned, sooner rather than later. And this is not only in the low-income countries, even in Europe, like in Greece, it just shows the problems of delaying restructuring. And really all but the most resilient debtors, prolonged liquidity problems will always turn into solvency problems. This is actually not just true for sovereigns, it's also true for banks and generally for corporates. So what is clear, in my opinion, is that we need a systemic solution, and I'm finishing very soon, to a systemic problem. And that the time has come to revisit again the reform of the international debt architecture, as the title of the IMF paper suggests. But I would go a little bit further than the IMF paper does in this particular occasion, and perhaps go back to the proposals that Anne Kruger put almost nearly 20 years ago with regard to the SDRM and sovereign debt restructuring mechanism as a predictable and orderly system for debt restructuring to provide a speedy and sufficient debt relief to countries that need it. In my opinion, the time is ripe for resurrecting such architectural discussion. And FT editorial earlier this week also reminded us that it's actually in the interest of creditors, not just debtors, to restructure payment obligations when changed economic circumstances, and clearly COVID is one of them, make those payment obligations much more onerous than expected. Thank you very much, and apologies for the interruption at the beginning.
Thank you, Professor Lastra. This is one of the problematics that technology and private issues come along in calls and webinars. So it's something that happens. It's something that we get used to during this particular period. So no problem.
Thank you for the understanding. Actually, the first time it happens to me, but I've seen it happens to other people. So
it happens. So we can understand easily. So thank you for your intervention, and I think we will develop a little bit more in the discussion between us later on about some arguments. So for now, I can give the floor to Ivan Romo with his intervention on Latin America. Ivan.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. Okay, I will go in the train of thoughts that Professor Lastra, interesting presentation. For talking about sovereign debt, you necessarily have to refer to emerging markets. And emerging markets means Latin America and the Caribbean. For sake of this presentation, I will be using information collected from the CEPAL, that is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean from the UN, for the BID, the Development Investment Bank, and other institutions that it's available publicly. So I will not go tiring you with the numbers, but going into this, I want to make a little overview of what's happening in Latin America and how we arrive to this point. To understand sovereign debt in Latin America, we need to go to the beginning of 1950, at the end of the Second World War, everybody looks to Latin America and they say there is a good part of the world to invest. It's an emerging market, and everything started going well. All the Latin American countries start developing with state investment. So the main sectors of the economy were developed by the government. In 1973 to 1981, more than the half of the money invested all around the world came to America Latina. So that's when the problem started. At the end of the 80s, America Latina started to migrate the state investment to private investment, but a lot of money came from private investors. And nevertheless, the expenses of the government were the same. So the governments in America Latina had to take money from other places, and they start growing all the debt. Nowadays, we have an average of 67% of the GDP, of the gross income of the countries, as debt in America Latina. I will go with some numbers, not a lot of the more important countries. Mexico has 53% of its income in debt, Argentina 126, Brazil 91%, Colombia 51, Chile 27, and Venezuela, with the last data that we have, was around 43. But this data was taken in 2004, so it cannot be reliable. So I do believe that the not official numbers state that it's around 200% of the debt. So it means that they have to work 2 years without collecting anything to pay the whole debt. This is a huge problem because the situation between the sovereign debt and the COVID has been very conflicted in America Latina, because it cannot be handled like in other countries in which you can send people to their homes. People in America Latina cannot afford to be 2 or 3 weeks locked down, so activities have to continue. In America Latina, there have been 4 main problems regarding the COVID situation. That is, the tax revenue has decreased. The foreign private capital has been transferred to another countries. The export revenue collapsed. The America Latina most important income is exports because it's commodities manufacturing. So it has collapsed, and massive unemployment. It is supposed that to afford the COVID crisis, America Latina needs around $2.4 trillion just to keep going in this scenario, not talking about the sovereign debt or the payments, the overdue payments. The private sectors will not be an important part of the solution. All of the things are being focused on discussing debt relief, that it's not, it doesn't seem that it will be possible to have that. And another important participant of this is the state investment from other countries, but most of the debt is for private sectors that are on stock markets. I will try to share with you just a little table in which you can see that for 2018, the debt of Latin America, external debt, was more than 1,800 US billion dollars. And you can see how it's construct this debt. So for concluding with this, I will say that China has been the best investor in the last year. In 2018, they invested 272 billion US dollars in Latin America. I believe that for now, this is enough. Carlo, I will go back to you.
Okay. If you want, you have a little bit of time more if you want to go more, Ivan. Otherwise, we can switch to Steve, and we can discuss about the question later on.
No, we will talk the questions
Okay.
afterwards. I think that's...
Okay, so thank you, Ivan. And we can go to Steve Kargman and develop a little bit more about Venezuela and Argentina and the general situation of the sovereign debt. So, Steve, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlo. It's a pleasure to be participating today with you and our other distinguished panelists. I will touch on some issues related to the emerging markets generally, picking up on some of the issues that Ivan just touched on and that Rosa also alluded to. First, I want to make the broad point that the emerging markets, broadly speaking, around the world have been hit with a perfect storm. The global economic slowdown has seriously affected their economies, and there have been disruptions, obviously, in global supply chains, which has negatively impacted the emerging markets, which export into those supply chains. It was referenced earlier, but many of the emerging markets are heavily dependent on commodity exports, whether it's oil or copper or zinc, and so on and so forth. And commodity prices have dropped very sharply. And so that has a very serious impact on a number of the emerging economies. One only has to think of the oil exporting countries, with the price of oil having collapsed earlier this year. That's a major drop in revenues for a number of these governments around the world, whether in Latin America or Africa, some of the big oil producers there, Nigeria, Angola, all the way through Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan and so forth. So the collapse in commodity prices has had as I say, a very pronounced impact on the emerging markets. And then a number of these economies are also very dependent on tourism. And with the cessation of international air travel, that's had a huge impact on many of these economies. One only has to think of the Caribbean, which is so heavily dependent on tourism, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. The sub-Saharan African countries depend heavily on tourism. A number of the Asian countries, Philippines, Thailand, and so on and so forth, they depend heavily on tourism. At the onset of the crisis, as I believe Rosa alluded to, there was a major flight of capital out of these markets, what economists call a sudden stop. And so what had been major inflows of capital into these countries suddenly reversed, and tens of billions of dollars, maybe $80 billion or more, flowed out of these markets all of a sudden. And another issue is that many of these economies, this is often below the radar, many of these economies depend on remittances from their workers who have gone overseas and send back remittances to their home countries. And so this could be a major source of foreign exchange for a number of these countries. One only has to think, for example, of the Philippines or some of the Central American countries or the South Asian countries that send many workers abroad for employment, and they send their checks or a good part of their checks back to their home countries. And with the economies slowing down, if not shutting down, those employment opportunities have dried up. And so the flow of money via remittances has also slowed down considerably. I saw a figure in the last few days that remittances globally are expected to drop by at least 20% this year. And as a result of the outflow of capital and other pressures on these governments, the national currencies of many of these countries have depreciated very sharply. And this ties right into our sovereign debt discussion, because to the extent that these countries, these governments have debt denominated in hard currencies, it becomes much more difficult to service that debt if their local currency is depreciating. But again, this is a worldwide phenomenon. The Brazilian real has depreciated sharply, the Argentine peso, Mexican peso, the Nigerian naira, the South African rand, Indonesian rupiah. It's a global phenomenon, this depreciation, and that will make it much more difficult for a number of these countries to service their debt. I should mention it's not just sovereign debt, but to the extent their companies have borrowed in foreign currencies, that will also have a detrimental effect on their ability to service their debt. I should shift gears quickly to mention that really the COVID crisis has posed a dual strain on the balance sheets of the sovereigns. On the one hand, they've had to make unanticipated and large expenditures to deal with the public health crisis in their countries. So they've had to buy PPE and other medical equipment. So that is one source of pressure. The other source of pressure on their balance sheets is the expenditures they've had to make on economic recovery and stimulus programs, whether for companies or for households. So that poses another major strain on sovereign finances. And more of a medium-term concern, but very serious concern, and it's not so far out in the future, quite frankly, is that revenues coming into these governments, tax revenues, are certain to drop because the economic activity has dropped so considerably with the lockdowns in these economies. I'll just wrap up, I think I have maybe one more minute, by mentioning two of the big situations in Latin America that, going back to what Rosa was discussing, these were pre-existing before COVID hit. Venezuela has 150 billion plus of debt. Argentina just did a restructuring with its foreign bondholders, 65 billion of debt. And so those are major challenges. Venezuela, it's unlikely that anything will be done on the restructuring front until there's a new government, until there's a change from the Maduro regime. And that's for a number of reasons, including sanctions from the US and so on. Argentina, while it's completed its negotiations and restructuring with its foreign bondholders, it now moves on to discussions with the IMF, and Argentina has a loan from the IMF outstanding of about $44 billion. So they'll have to work with the IMF on some type of restructuring or rescheduling of that in the coming months. The problem with Venezuela is the economy is in virtual collapse. Its main industry, oil, is totally dysfunctional. and very little oil is now being produced in Venezuela. It's, I should mention, of course, that the Venezuelan situation is not just an economic and financial problem, some would say catastrophe, but it's a human catastrophe. It's a humanitarian crisis of major magnitude. And so, but anyway, when Venezuela finally gets to restructuring, they'll not just have to focus on restructuring the debt, but more fundamentally, they'll have to rebuild and reconstruct the economy. To just conclude with one quick thought on Argentina. Argentina, as most of our viewers will know, is a perennial sovereign debt defaulter and has had these debt crises on a regular basis throughout its history. So Argentina rather, really has to develop an economic strategy over the longer term for having a very solid economic base so it can deal with its debt servicing issues. And in particular, it might be useful for Argentina and for those international financial institutions involved with Argentina to focus on some type of long-term economic strategy that emphasizes sectors of the economy where Argentina can enjoy a comparative advantage. I'll stop right there.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for your impressions on the sovereign debts on some Latin American countries. It's always interesting to hear what is happening abroad for an Italian or for French people, and for each one of us to know what is happening and what is the real situation of the debt in general. So thank you for your contribution, and now I leave the floor to Professor Paulus. Professor.
Thank you very much. Like Rosa, I would like to begin with thanking you, Carlo, and Annika, and Brandy, and the entire NextGen institution by now for inviting me to such a fascinating conference, and to sit on such a panel is a huge honor for me, and I really learned from you. It's fantastic what the collective knowledge here in this room alone. I mean, it's really breathtakingly. Unfortunately, I take over the role of Cassandra. Rosa didn't want to have it, and I take it because that is something which is what bothers me now for quite some time. And there is something lurking under the carpet, as it were. I know only the catchword, and the rest is my own imagination. So the catchword I'm talking about is weaponization of financial instruments. And that is something which is said to be a program which was developed something like roughly 30 years ago at the Wall Street. And it means something which is probably not very attractive, at least not for debtors. It means, or let me repeat it just in order to make it perfectly clear, it's a weaponization of financial instruments. I turn financial instruments, contracts, into weapons. Now, we have heard from all my panelists, previous speaking panelists, that COVID-19 causes the states to take up new money. They need additional money. And this is usually done by, in legal terms by loans. Loan in which sense soever, not necessarily the private law type of borrowing something from the other in a particular shape or feature under the private law. In what way soever, I want the state, Ruritania, needs money from someone who is ready to lend money to them. So these are contracts. And this is now where my fear and where Cassandra begins to speak. Let me begin with saying a few words about what I guess that weaponization in the Wall Street sense might mean. And as a matter of fact, nobody's speaking openly about it. You can't look up in Google what means weaponization of financial instrument. Of course, nobody's talking about it. That is a program, that's a strategy, which is, of course, kept secret. So therefore, I'm forced to do some assumptions. So when and if contracts are turned into weapons, this will probably mean that you want to get a victory over the other party. You want probably to conquer it or to destroy the other party. In private law, there are indeed a couple of new instruments which play an emerging role. It began in the United States and now it's pretty much everywhere, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. The one thing is loan-to-own strategy. Loan-to-own strategies are, I'm not going into it, it would take too much time, so just take it. It's a way of using insolvency law and the debt equity swap for a takeover. So in order to avoid the troubles of going through an official takeover proceeding, you do it in an easier way by going through an insolvency proceeding and by means of a debt equity swap. In the end of the day, you will have the other party. So you will have conquered the other party. Another example that I could give here, and probably further ones do exist, which I do not know up to now, is the credit default swap. The credit default swap is, by definition, it's a kind of insurance contract. Again, details of no interest here. But the purpose or the background of entering into a credit default swap is to kick your debtor out of the business, because then you make a profit. So this is in private law, or these are potential possible examples for weaponization of financial instruments in the private law sector. What, however, does it mean or could it mean in the public law sector? And once again, we have right now an enormous increase of loan contracts, and hopefully nobody is listening, because I don't want to get this known or to incentivize anyone to start such a business. There is one contract which might be an emanation of weaponization of financial instruments in the state sector, and that is at least of what I do know. There is a loan contract between Russia and Ukraine from a couple of years ago. And if you look at the details of the contract, it is quite easy, to put it mildly and diplomatically. It's quite easy for the creditor, in that case Russia, to push the debtor country, Ukraine, out of the capital market. And that is where you have in the public sector, where you have won, so to speak. That is the way how you can get a victory over the enemy, the debtor, by kicking this country, this state, out of the capital market. So one of the clauses in this contract is, for instance, that Ukraine is obliged to keep the debt level constantly below 60%. Another clause is saying that, of course, cross default at any non-payment, at any default of any claim. But here comes the addition. Any claim means not only any claim against Russia in themselves, but also all dependencies of Russia. And now just imagine, if you look closer into the contract, you recognize that a company like Gazprom is also a dependency of Russia. If Gazprom is raising the prices for the gas, then Ukraine might not be able to pay, and then all of a sudden you have cross default, and then all of a sudden I don't know how much billion dollars are due at this very moment. That is usually the end of a country, and then this country is out of the capital market. So that is what I, Cassandra, see as what is my fear in the context of the COVID situation for sovereigns. I stop here. Carlo, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Paulus. Yeah, it's quite interesting, this last call regarding the weaponization of financial instruments. Hopefully, good faith is something that we want to put in the relationships also between states. It is not easy because it is not easy. There is always some interest in competition also. This competition should be made in a good faith sense, but sometimes we know that it's not. We hope that this this scenario, which is quite dramatic, will not happen. Sometimes we know that happens. But taking in consideration this last call of Professor Paulus, I kindly ask also to the speakers to intervene in their thoughts on these questions that I will make in these last minutes. Taking into consideration that there could be in future a scenario like this, weaponization of financial instruments. What do you think it can be done in order to avoid the diffusion of these practices? I mean, we need to try to find something that prevents these situations. Whoever wants to answer, you might.
Can I? Ivan, go ahead.
No, please, Professor, go ahead.
Thank you. Carlo, you're absolutely right. The dramatic thing is that in the public sector, of course, you have other players who are following a certain agenda. It's right now, it so happens because they are by now the richest country. It's China. China is offering help, and China is, of course, when you have a loan agreement between two sovereigns, it is usually not that country A, China, is giving a loan to country B, Ukraine, Russia, Nigeria, whoever is there. They are offering even to Italy or Greece. It's not so much that they want to make a good deal. I mean, they are not really interested in having a wonderful business which earns them an additional $1 million, $10 million, $100 million. They couldn't care less. This is not the point. The contracts are usually something which are declared to be a loan agreement, but we as lawyers know it's something completely different. I've written something time ago on a loan agreement between China and Nigeria, and in the end of the day, when you're looking at the contract, it's a contract which is a sales contract, a purchase agreement by which China is purchasing the commodities, the oil. They want to have, they are buying the access to oil. And if this is the case, then, and if if the lawyers are brave enough and the courts are brave enough, then I would assume that if we introduce, and that brings me back to what Rosa was saying in the beginning and what the IMF is after, if we introduce as I call it, resolvency proceeding on the sovereign sphere, in which you could really determine what sort of contract is it, then, and that's what I'm saying as an insolvency lawyer, we have a dramatic difference between a purchase agreement and a loan agreement. Loan agreements are completely different treated in insolvency law than purchase agreements. So if that would be something, I mean, that's a dream I won't live any longer, and forgive me, even Ivan, you won't live and experience it. But I mean, that is where I think we should strive for. That is where law should bring us to.
Okay,
May
Ivan.
I add something, Carlo?
Sure.
I believe that it's very difficult to assess how to prevent these kind of issues, because when I was reviewing the data for this conference, and in 2009, I realized that the world owed 3.5 times the GDP in all these financial instruments. I'm not really sure how it has increased for now, but you can say 4 or 5 times. So it means that we need to work 5 years without eating to pay all the debt. There is no a possible solution to that. The only question is that if the debt release that everything is asking for will be granted. I do not think so, because also, do you think, what do humankind will do with 5 times the GDP? Where is that money? Where is that kind of resources? But unfortunately, I do not see that a possible outcome of that. But the only thing that I had in mind is that when I realized that, I insist this was 2009, so we are still in the track. So we will find another way to keep going in the track.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. Probably the collateral is something that is important in this kind of and relevant in this kind of situations. And I think that maybe I don't want to have the Colosseum sold for on the position of Italy, if there is any kind of debt like this. So it would be potentially something that is interesting for someone. So we hope not that this won't happen, but I can understand. Okay, thank you. And now going back to Professor Lastra intervention, I was thinking about the position of major creditors in sovereign debt situations. Sometimes we look at the role of major creditors, and they can play a particular and interesting role in dealing with a crisis. So I asked to Professor Lastra, but also to the other speakers who want to intervene, what do you think about the role of hedge funds? During also these years, we also assisted to some tendencies from various countries to limit operations of vulture funds like UK and Belgium. So what do you think of this kind of legislative interventions? They can be supportive in dealing with the sovereign debt crisis or not?
I mean, there has been talk, and there continues to be talk. Some people, of course, call the hedge funds vulture funds. I will refrain now from calling hedge funds vulture funds. But the IMF paper talks about these, it calls them targeted statutory tools, which will obviously bind the judges. And that is the whole issue about this targeted legislation. It is controversial. It is nonetheless another instrument, another kind of intercreditor instrument that can be used. I should like to say that, you know, there are 3 examples that are mentioned in the IMF paper. The HIPC UK legislation. There have been actually some talks in the UK about doing something similar now, but so far they have gone nowhere. But there are talks about something like that in France and in Belgium, and the European Parliament at some point also look about maybe doing something in Europe. I think it's important that there is a choice between measures which are designed to constrain creditor rights and measures that are designed to constrain creditor remedies. So these legislation, the 2010 HIPC legislation and the Belgian legislation, were actually examples of the former, of measures to constrain creditor rights by imposing a stay on litigation, for instance, inconsistent with the DSSI. And these measures, what they boil down is to a message that the creditor may not be able to obtain a court judgment, or at least quickly obtain a court judgment in respect of what otherwise be a fairly, you know, claim for money due, past but not paid. I think different is the interference in creditor remedies against foreign sovereigns. And that is something that maybe can be considered going forward in the post-COVID scenario. And that may be less sensitive. After all countries have laws that shield various kinds of foreign state property from attachment from commercial litigants, embassies, consulates, military property, foreign central bank assets, and so on and so forth. So whether there is any future prospect, for instance, for some US-UK coordination on immunizing from attachment assets of a debtor country that is undergoing a debt restructuring with IMF World Bank support, that might be an avenue. So I think I've spoken enough. I've given perhaps a long answer to what was a relatively straightforward question, but perhaps some of my illustrious and distinguished colleagues want to add something on what is surely a very controversial topic.
Do you want to intervene? I mean, there has been a role, particularly strategic, I think, if I have well studied in the Argentinian recent restructuring of the debt. I think BlackRock Fund intervened in the restructuring of the debt. So in this situation, maybe there could be a particular role of an hedge fund like BlackRock in the restructuring. What do you think?
Carlo?
Yeah.
I think the specter of this hedge fund, vulture fund litigation is something that really motivated the parties in the recent Argentine restructuring to reach a deal. And of course, they took full advantage of the enhanced collective action clauses there because, as you know, in the prior Argentine restructuring from the early 2000s, which really dragged on until a settlement was reached in 2016, the hedge funds or vulture funds, whatever you want to call them, they pursued very aggressive litigation against Argentina. And so I think the parties in the recent Argentine case very much had that in mind and tried to develop a solution earlier rather than later. And of course, those collective action clauses, the most recent iteration of those collective action clauses, the 2014 ICMA style clauses, the enhanced aggregated collective action clauses, those were very important. So everybody still has that in mind, that the terrible experience from the early 2000s.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Okay, we can try to also make a jump and go to Europe a little bit. And thinking about the recent developments and provisions that have been adopted by the EU in supporting the states in the COVID situation in order to avoid deep impact on economies internally. I was thinking what could be the influence of I mean in Europe there has been this particular maneuver of creating a recovery fund which will provide Italy is waiting a lot for this, which will provide almost 750 billion euro for the next generation EU. So I was thinking which could be the political impact and economical impact on the economies of the EU member states. I think maybe Professor Paulus and Professor Lastra, but everyone who wants to give an answer can give it.
Rosa, is it okay when I begin?
Yeah, you begin, please, and then I continue.
Thank you. Let me, I'm asking and approaching Rosa, because I wanted to add, and that is part of the answer that I want to give to you. Carlo.
Professor, sorry, taking in consideration we have 6 minutes left.
Oh, so I'm fast. There is we in Germany, actually, I was proposing it and I was pushing it a little bit. We in Germany, I wanted Germany to introduce also a legislation like the Belgian one, and we failed. The politicians were not interested. They were just not interested. Simple, as simple as that, full stop, period. And it is the horrible thing with the Europeans, I should say with the continental Europeans. The Brits are different because of their history. We think in terms, or we start to develop new concepts not before we ourselves are in dire need. We lack usually the imagination that what happens to Argentina, Steve was saying they are in the habit of falling back into default on a regular basis. We see this as something we observe and then we think, how can we help? But we never dream of that this could happen to us ourselves as well. And for that reason, I mean, that is what I hope for, that this crisis will be used. Never let a crisis go without learning anything from it, to quote slightly differently Churchill. This is a crisis which could perfectly teach us how important solidarity is. I mean, that is, in the end of the day, that what I hope for, that politicians learn, that solidarity within Europe, as within the globe as such, of course, but to begin with, within Europe is something we have to learn. And that is where I see some light at the end of the tunnel in this 750 billion euro fund. I see it in the 500 billion by France and Germany, and so on and so forth. The various concepts. Maybe we learn something like a solidarity, and that brings me back to the last webinar that I had the pleasure and honor to be with the NextGen. I ended also with solidarity. In Europe, we have to learn solidarity. Rosa?
Thank you very much for mentioning the point of solidarity, because I was asked to write by the European Parliament. I have to disclose that I'm an expert of their monetary panel that helps prepare the monetary dialogue with the president of the ECB now, Madame Lagarde. And I was asked to write two papers, one on ECB accountability and the other one on the ECB mandate. And on the ECB mandate, which is obviously established by the treaty, I'm not going to go because we have little time, and the seminar today is not about the ECB mandate, but I entitled the paper, and I can make it available for NextGen, Perspective on Solidarity and Sustainability, because I think that there is a need for rethinking mandates of institutions such as the European Central Bank, as well as the institutions which are behind the EU Recovery Fund from this perspective. And I think that in the context of NextGen, the next generation, this is what is going to bind Europe together. Not necessarily a strict commitment to price stability when, inflation or deflation is not the most pressing worry for people that are losing their jobs and fighting the disease. Notwithstanding the importance of price stability, I've always defended it, and I've always defended central bank independence. I think that we need, as a European community of nations, we need to move forward. And I think that the recovery fund, like you say, is a first. I mean, never before had there been so much amount of money put on the table. I mean, let's remind ourselves that the only policy that the EU level is centralized is monetary policy. Fiscal policy remains decentralized at the level of the member states, and the fiscal budget of the EU is a very tiny budget. So this measure was a real first, a real sense of solidarity. So like you, I'm conscious that we have little time left and we need to at least give a minute to Carlo to bring back the debate to the subject of today. But I think it was a very first good step in this direction of trying to build a future in Europe in which, the greatest strengths of the European Union are passed on to the next generation through a set of values that the next generation can actually feel attracted to. And I think those two words of solidarity and sustainability are fundamental. Economic sustainability, climate sustainability, social sustainability are fundamental challenges related perhaps more broadly to the subject of today, but certainly to the future of Europe and probably of the international order if one goes back to the post-World War II international economic order. So thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe solidarity is, as Professor Paulus was underlining just a few minutes before, and what he underlined a lot during another webinar session, is very important. I think it will be.
Carlo, could I add one quick thought?
Sure, Steve, please.
When you mention Europe, I think back to the Eurozone crisis, which I think may have some lessons for the current COVID crisis as it impacts sovereign debt restructuring. I'm just going to make this a 1-minute point because I'm very conscious of the fact that we're running out of time. But one of the big issues, for example, in the Greek situation was that the official sector, the so-called Troika, the EC, the ECB, and the IMF, they prescribed measures for Greece that fall under the heading of austerity measures. And as such, Greece was already in a recession. Many economists believe the austerity measures, which are basically economically contractionary measures, made the recession even worse. And Greece ultimately basically had a economic depression. The only reason I allude to this now is because in the COVID environment, many of these economies around the world are in an economic slowdown, in a recession. And so the outside creditors, when they're going through the restructurings, will have to be very mindful of the fact that they have to be very careful in applying austerity measures to these economies, because the cure could be worse than the disease. And so whether it's in Argentina or many of the other countries that are in economic slowdown, if austerity measures are prescribed by the official sector, that has the potential to exacerbate the underlying economic problem. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that this is a very important point. I think that you anticipated me a little bit. I think in this situation, creditors must think about the whole situation and the impact of COVID. And I think maybe the concept of solidarity must enter into the heads of creditors eventually. It is not something that is so common to see, but maybe not the concept of solidarity, but the concept of balancing the interests and seeing what is better for the continuation of the activities, economical activities and monetary activities for the countries, and the interest of the creditor to maybe have something satisfied, but a little bit less, not to exaggerate at the maximum. This is something that maybe it's very important. So I think we have run out of time about 3 minutes. Does anybody wants to say anything more? We could have 2 minutes more.
Just a final argument, Carlo. In the last meeting that the UN had on August, they were discussing about the FACE, the Fund Against COVID Economics, and this fund will be worldwide. It's not only focused in emerging markets or Africa or so on. It's a worldwide fund to help to prevent the COVID effects.
Okay, yeah. In this optic of solidarity is something that it could be something interesting. Okay, so thank you to everybody. Thanks to it has been an honor to speak with all of you. It's an argument that for me it's becoming very, very interesting. I'm dealing with some issues regarding sovereign debt professionally, so it's always a pleasure to hear from from the giants of of this kind of arguments. So thank you very much to everybody, and we will organize another panel on sovereign debt at the end of October. So stay in touch, and thank you to everybody. Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.